Indians have so many activities going on at any given time. So, for example, and there are some who are not having any activities but are closed. I was told the Brazilians are closed because it's the carnival. The Chinese are closed because it's Lunar New Year. And then there are some who are receiving delegations. The Canadians, they have the Prime Minister in town, and so on and so forth. So it's actually impossible to aggregate a large number of people from various missions at the same time. So what we're going to do is, iterative such events, so that you can more of you can get to know about not just Indian foreign policy. We hope to do also some on domestic issues that may also help you to understand, get a grasp of your tasks here. So today we're going to kickstart the training by talking about great powers and how India relates to them, and what is the past and the future of this. And I'm going to be dwelling on the current dynamics as well as maybe doing some future projections. The first point I want to make is that India is not yet a great power. There are all kinds of concepts and terms that are used in popular parlance. Some people say India is a superpower, some people say India is a great power, a major power, but as an academic who's trained in the discipline of international relations, I will not classify it as a great power. It is not yet a great power. What are the attributes of a great power? The way we define it in academia, and some of you have gone through academic IR studies yourselves, or even as practitioners, great power is basically a nation state that has significant influence in different corners of the world, not just in its own neighborhood, far-flung parts of the world, and one which is able to mold the external international environment as per its nationally set or domestically set preferences. Right? That's typically how we define a great power. In other words, one that can shape global institutions, global norms, the overall global balance of power. That's usually the definition of a great power. India is not yet a great power, but it is not merely a regional power either. Regional power, India became a regional power in 1971. You all may have done your history. What happened in 1971? 1971? That's right, that's right. Creation of Bangladesh and the breakup of Pakistan into two essentially established India as a regional power. Before 1971, there still seemed to be some questions about whether India was supreme in South Asia or not, because there were two wings, the East Pakistan and the West Pakistan, and we were in a way hemmed in on both sides strategically. So it was not possible at that time to from independence until 1971 for India to be considered even a regional power. 1971, through war and through military intervention and through carving up a new state, essentially India became a regional power, or a predominant power in South Asia. But since then, it's almost 50 years, almost 45 years since the creation of Bangladesh, right? So what has happened, in my view, is that we have moved from being merely a regional power towards becoming what the current Modi government calls a leading power. But we are not yet a leading power or a great power. It's a work in progress. So what does it require for a country to become a great power, and how does it relate to other great powers? That's the content of what I'm going to speak today. The attributes of power, usually we measure it in terms of military strength, economic dynamism and resources, and the third category, which of course has become very popular, which is soft power, right? Our ability to attract and influence others through diplomacy, through cultural power projection, and through by just being a certain way. For example, a country that is liberal or democratic or which has a fairly established system of civil liberties, multiculturalism, all these become the third element. Harvard's Joseph Nye has this concept of the three-dimensional chessboard: hard power, which is military and economic, and soft power. And there are three dimensions by which you can measure. So comprehensive national strength of a country. So by that yardstick, there are only two great powers today, at least the way we rigorously define it in international relations as academics: China and the United States. There are no other great powers that we can think of. Why? Because of these three reasons. As you know, if you measure in purchasing power parity terms, PPP terms, China is already the #1 economy in the world, ahead of the United States. In nominal terms, China is #2. But arguably, and in fact, I recommend strongly that you all read a very interesting book, irrespective of your respective regional interests, a recent one by called Destined for War by Graham Allison. It's about the most important great power relationship of today, which is China and the United States. And in Destined for War, he argues that PPP, the purchasing power parity method, is a better measure of overall power because it is based on prices, right? Current prices and cost of living and ability. Yeah, please. Destined for War. Destined for War, Graham Allison. It's a very recent book, just 3 to 4 months ago. It's about US, China, and whether they can avoid war and what is the future of this most important great power relationship of our times. So what he says is that the PPP is a better method of measuring power because it shows how much material capabilities you can generate and project, right, at given prices. So, and he argues that by that yardstick, China is the #1 economy in the world, not #2. And of course, militarily, the second layer, if you want to stick to the spatial vision of three-layered chessboard, definitely in economic terms, if you use PPP, China is the most powerful country. Then in military, of course, the United States has a major advantage and a huge lead still over China. I think the nearest competitor in military terms to the United States in conventional and unconventional is actually Russia, although economically it is far behind today. So it's an interesting chessboard. If you do the current analysis, in United States is #2 on economic on the economic plane, #1 in the military plane, but China is not #2 in military, but actually probably #3, behind Russia, which still, as you know, despite the sanctions, despite the economic troubles, despite the fall in the oil prices, maintains a strong military, which is also being projected globally in far-flung places, in Syria, in Libya, and parts of Africa and elsewhere. So, so now if you come to the third layer, that is where actually it's an open field in terms of competition. There are far many more players than just the United States. United States does have, of course, significant soft power attributes. You know, Hollywood. Have you watched Black Panther? It's an amazing movie. It just shows the power of American movie industry and how global it can be. There are, of course, other things. Their corporate houses, their household names, right? Their ability to penetrate people's minds in far-flung places through their products and services. So they do have these soft power attributes, and I suppose the missions, the diplomatic missions, American missions usually do a lot of activities to keep the U.S. interests and American image in the eyes of people. Their aid agencies, a whole plethora of instruments they have for soft power. So they do have a lead, but I think it's shrinking. And if you go to Africa, if you go to Latin America, as you know, China has advanced tremendously and has displaced the United States in these parts of the world. And it's very hard to argue that United States is number one. It is not number one even in aid and soft power in many parts of Africa and Latin America. So this is where we are today. So where does India fit into this? Economically, by PPP terms, is the third largest economy in the world by PPP measurement. Militarily, it is way behind China, Russia, and United States, and we have a long catch-up to do. Soft power, arguably, it's among the top 5, although these estimates vary. There's a consulting firm in London that actually, I'll just share the name of this. They measure soft power of countries and rank them top 30. As of last year, India was not even figuring in the top 10. But there are different ways of measuring it, and we would like to believe that India actually has more soft power than is usually credited with. So if you take these 3 yardsticks, the ones we are dealing with, essentially the great powers we have to deal with in today's time are China and the United States. These are, of course, in many ways, when leaders meet, they often talk about this, that this is the most important bilateral relationship that will define the future of the world. We hear it when US and China meet, we hear it when India and China meet, and we hear it when India and the United States meet. As early as Obama administration, I think 2008 or 2009, or even before that, during the Bush era, the leaders of both sides started saying that this is the defining relationship of the 21st century. And we still use that. And it's not rhetorical because of the power projections that suggest that by 2030 or so, it's essentially these 3 which will be the major powers in the world over the next 15 years or so, right? So obviously, when the big guns meet or interact, it becomes significant and consequential because the stakes become high. It's not like, some of the smaller countries are meeting, or one of the big guns and a small country, right? So we are talking about the equations between the most important or significant players. So India, at the mindset level, even though on the 3-layered chessboard it is still got some catch-up to do, at the mindset level, my view is that India is starting to behave like a major power and to approach the rest of the world with that kind of approach. How shall I put it? With the outlook is of being an equal to China and the United States. Let me explain this. Historical baggage is also, as you know, all of your diplomats, and each of your countries, you have experienced a lot, and therefore that determines your present and your outlooks. Now, in terms of historical baggage, we have a lot to shed to really become a major power. In fact, I would add this 4th layer, which NIE doesn't recognize, which is a kind of a national will or preparedness to become a major power. So that's where India is slowly moving that direction. Let me explain this a little more. What do we mean by having an outlook or an attitude of being a major power? It requires shedding the historical baggage of being underprivileged or downtrodden or a victim. It requires a certain sense of confidence that I have arrived or I am about to arrive, and that I'm going to deal with these major powers with a sense that I am nominally I'm their equal. As you know, all 193 UN member states are equal in status and dignity. But also in terms of capabilities and intent and power projection, I can be their equal, and I will not be a subordinate to them. So this is a very important, and nor will I approach the world affairs as if I am somehow being oppressed by these major powers, or that I am under their kind of suzerainty. But historically India has had this. After independence, the whole post-colonial mindset was that we are weak, we are very poor, we are a developing country, and we oppose the imperialism of superpowers, and we will try and steer clear of them. That used to be the major doctrine. It was a doctrine based on a realistic notion of our weakness, right? What we call non-alignment, 1947 onwards. Now, it was based on the idea, theoretically at least, that these two major superpowers of the time, Soviet Union, United States, were exploitative and were dragging everyone into their orbits willy-nilly and forcing them to serve their interests. And so we had this whole anti-colonial outlook at the time, which suited our abilities at that time. We were very poor. At the dawn of independence, for your information, by economic historians argue that 90% of India was poor, and as you know, the wrenching partition and all this really kept us weak and internally absorbed to be able to play any massive role on the world stage. But still, under Prime Minister Nehru, we did play a role using largely our diplomatic acumen and leadership, especially in the developing world. Although the defeat to China in 1962, which was a humiliating blow, in many ways reduced our leverage with even with the developing world and our prestige in the developing world in Africa, Latin America and Asia. So the mindset at that time, and which carried on for several decades, was that we have to steer clear, or where necessary at sometimes opportunistically align with one of the major powers. In 1971, the war we just discussed, without a major, almost like an alliance with the Soviet Union, although it was called Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, there was no way we could have achieved military success. Because if you read the diplomatic history of the time, both United States and China opposed the breakup of Pakistan and were attempting to prevent the breakup of Pakistan through military and other means. But it was because India aligned, if not allied, aligned with the Soviet Union that we could achieve this. So neutrality was not really practical because of the contingencies. At various junctures, and for your information, after the 1962 war with China, which was a decisive blow to India's punch shield and Prime Minister Nehru's liberal outlook, we actually cooperated with the Americans, secretly training Tibetan guerrillas from 1962 until I think the early 1970s, for over a decade. There is a place in Uttarakhand, those who go to the Himalayas for a holiday, there's a place called Chakrata. I don't know if you've heard or ever been there. Now it's just like a pretty little hill station. But in the 60s and 70s, India trained Tibetan guerrillas with the CIA assistance. And this was done while we were saying that we are non-aligned and that we have nothing to do with either of the major powers. There is a book by Conboy and Morrison called War in the Himalayas, the CIA's secret campaign in Tibet. It shows the degree with which India cooperated with the United States to train over 12,000 Tibetan guerrillas for strategic reasons, right? So anyway, what I'm trying to say is, the international arena is so dynamic and so full of threats and opportunities that you cannot afford to be truly neutral. You could not afford to be truly neutral even in those days. So on paper we are non-aligned, but at various junctures, as per the strategic needs, we had to work closely with the Soviets or closely with the Americans. So what was our attitude at the time? It was that nonetheless, these are big powers, and at the UN, at international forums, our rhetoric was largely to oppose Western colonialism, or to some extent Soviet model and their expansion in rest of the world. So India was more like I want to protect myself and shield myself from these barbaric big guys who are out to get me, to put it in one way. That was the psychology. So you cannot be a great power if you think that way. You have to be a great power if you think about how can I equal or even surpass these big guys. And that requires ambition. And that requires a kind of a set of guidelines and defined policy vision or doctrines, right? Foreign policy doctrines. That requires also significant enhancement of economic and military capacities and soft power capacities, and that requires also a willingness to take some risks and absorb costs in international affairs, and it requires power projection further and further away from your immediate neighborhood. So that's how you move from being a regional power to a great power, right? So what has happened, especially in the last 3 years, but definitely since the 21st century has arrived, is a kind of a push with a greater ambition for India to be dealing with the major powers in a different way, not seeking weapons from them or not seeking just to give you the example of 1962 war, there's a famous letter, it's available online, it's written by Prime Minister Nehru to JFK, October 1962. It says, Mr. President, the Chinese are overrunning Nepal, the northeast, now today it's called Arunachal Pradesh, and they are likely to reach Assam in no time. And if we do not receive immediate military assistance from the United States, the likelihood that the entire eastern India will be occupied by China. Of course, it didn't happen. The Chinese withdrew, and I'm not going to go into the details of, because it was not really a war for territory. It was related to Tibet. But the point was, as a supplicant, emergency, and we had nowhere to go, and suddenly we are appealing to the United States. By the time Western weapons had been sanctioned, the Chinese had made their point. Mao had taught us a lesson as he wanted to, and they had withdrawn. So the approach was, we are weak and we are needy and we need something from you in a desperate situation, or you are exploitative and we have nothing to do with you, don't touch me. Likewise, Soviet Union, we were dependent on them for a lot of things, especially from the 70s onwards. So now the view is that a lot has changed. As you know, India has been growing economically for the last 25 years. Barring one bad spell of 2009 to 2014, which is associated with what we call the UPA 2, the second term of the Manmohan Singh government, we've been growing at a steady clip, and at some point it even reached record levels like 8%, 9% per annum. Right? So that is in many ways the bedrock of India's rise. Without that, we would still be in a supplicant kind of situation. So today it's about a $3 trillion economy, I think. I think in PPP terms it's much larger. And the growth continues to this day. As you know, it's around 7%, and it has defied a lot of naysayers, and our demographic advantages generate hope for the next 10-15 years that will continue to keep growing like this. There are problems in the growth, there are inequities, there are distributional problems, infrastructural bottlenecks. Of course, I'm not denying all that. But nonetheless, compared to the 50s, 60s, or even until the 1980s or 90s, we are better off today. And our middle class is larger. By some estimates, it's over 30% of the population. And if we grow 7-8% for another 10 years, the middle class will be 60 or 70% of the population. Absolute poverty, which is around 25 or 30% today, may get into single digits if we continue growing. So, and then what do you do with the wealth, the surpluses that are generated, which becomes a means for conversion into into military spending? As you know, defense expenditure is measured by as a percentage of GDP, right? So, to be a major power, and major powers, if you look at it historically, have never spent less than 3 to 4% of GDP on defense. Go back in time. I will not consider Germany or Japan a major power today, simply because they don't spend this much on defense, and they don't have the military capability, although they are economically very, very major players. But it's not sufficient to be a great power, right? Neither Germany nor Japan or Brazil can equal China, simply because China has far larger military spending and capabilities and far bigger power projection worldwide. So that, therefore, I didn't even mention, I only said China and United States are the only two true great powers today. So when India grows, concomitant with that, we should expect more and more military strength to accumulate. Although lately, one of the disappointments, I'm a big fan of our Prime Minister, but one of the disappointments has been the decline in defense spending over the last 2 years. I think this year it's just 1.5% of GDP or something like that. It's the lowest in the last 60 years. And people are saying it's an election year, and that this is a kind of a, again, to use our jargon of international relations, this is an offshore balancing being done by the United States. Instead of doing it itself on its own, it's using India to curb China's rise. This is the popular narrative in China. Whenever I've been there, so why are you doing so much with the US? What's your problem? I mean, why aren't you, we should be working together as fellow Asians to build a new world, new world order. Why are you perpetuating the US-led world order? Are you, subordinate to them? This usually comes up a lot. So the question is, definitely, as I said, in the Indo-Pacific, there is a clear intent to work together in order to create what we call a stable balance of power. The Chinese simply say this is containment. And if you go back to Chinese strategic thought and behavior over the last, since the People's Republic was established, they do believe, they have always believed actually, even from Mao onwards, that India is in those days, they had more salty rhetoric. They used to call it running dog of Western imperialism. Nehru was labeled as nothing but a lackey of the West who was masquerading as a socialist. Mao never thought that Nehru was really a socialist. So it's like a bourgeois Western state that he's creating, which is essentially a tool of the West to hold back China. So that strain persists in China. So even though they want to maintain cordial ties and to avoid war, everybody wants to avoid war in this triangle. They believe that the dynamic is that India is a junior partner of the US and is being used by the Americans against China. So no matter what we do with the US, it immediately gets noticed and commented upon in China in a negative light. Now when the Doklam crisis happened, as you know, a few months ago, the Chinese were very incensed by what the Americans were saying or not saying. Very interesting. Of course, they had a whole psychological warfare to try and deter India from stepping back from protecting Bhutan, or saying that India should give up its colonial control over Bhutan and let Bhutan make its independent choices. That was how the Chinese were projecting the whole crisis. But they were especially angry when the US was saying, we don't believe in the language of threats and it should be resolved through negotiation and instead of face-to-face confrontation in the Himalayas. So they continue to believe that India and the United States are out to encircle it. So US alliance system in Asia, the formal allies, the ones I mentioned, Philippines, South Korea, Japan, the Chinese are inclined to think that India is de facto another ally of the United States. But the Indians, of course, don't agree to this. I've already mentioned why we think we have significant differences with the US on many parts, and we are hesitant to become a complete ally or to be suborned into their agenda completely. So this is a complex kind of triangular great power relations we have today. And the Indians often try to demonstrate their independence from the US, simply to prove the point to the Chinese. But the Chinese still think that, we are being used or exploited by the US. Now, is there a viable equilibrium that can emerge out of this triangular nuances that I've showed? I think for us, ideally, from the Indian point of view, this will become a stable triangle which can avoid war and conflicts only if we catch up and become China's equal in military and economic terms. As long as we are the weakest of the three, we may be in the top three of the world, but if India remains the weakest of the three, we will be under pressure from one or the other, and we cannot ward them off. So I think significant work lies ahead in terms of all the three dimensions, military, economic, and soft power, for India to be able to hold its own. But the intent is there, and we don't believe anymore in being a swing state that can be swayed this way or the other through inducement or through pressure, but rather carving out our own space as a third power center. So this is a big strategic endeavor, something that will take time and will take a lot of vision. And one of the things that I personally, my own mission has been, I address a lot of young people in this country, in schools and colleges, and I always tell them that it's not a bad thing to be nationalistic, and national will and aggregation of national resources and will is very, very central for a country to become a great power. You will find that highly divided societies, or the ones which are riven internally, or polarized. In fact, the argument is that one of the reasons for the United States' relative decline vis-a-vis China lately over the last decade or so is the extreme polarization within American society. There's a direct link between the domestic discord. As you know, Trump got only a little less than half of the population's vote, and it continues to be a highly divided society between liberal, conservative, populist, and liberal, whatever you want to call it. So a society that cannot muster kind of a collective national will fail in the race. And whether the Chinese are united or not, I mean, obviously it's a debatable question, but definitely the one-party state, for all its flaws, has been able to mobilize the society to think about becoming number one. We just interacted with Tsinghua University students. We were hosting them on our campus last month, and I was so struck by, and these are the topmost elite students of China, one of the biggest universities, Tsinghua, and they were all fairly convinced that China deserves to be number one and that it is on its way to be number one. So to wrap up, it requires that kind of mindset, to want to be number one, to have that ambition and the drive. Only Modi has been able to create that in this country. Before 2014, you had nothing like that. We were muddling through, and people were saying, let's first build toilets for all our people, then we'll think about competing with China and the United States. Sequential thinking. Sequential thinking is, until we have fixed all our domestic problems, we cannot compete with the big ones outside. Let's first focus on the welfare issues at home. Fix our governance problems, our infrastructure, corruption, and then maybe one day we can think of matching the Chinese or the United States. But frankly, that is a defeatist attitude, because that means that we are postponing India's rise for another 20 years or 30 years. Because most of the formations, the alignments and all these, if we don't do them now, it will be too late by the time we have abolished poverty in 20 years. So if you look at it, there is a historical window that will close. And therefore, I urge young people in India to develop this global consciousness, to think about the world, to be nationalistic, and to have pride in what our military is doing, for example. The baggage is that India has been bogged down by this fear of becoming another empire. You know, psychologically, during the non-alignment period, we say, we can't be like them, we are morally superior to them. We should not be aiming for hegemony or domination. You know, those are anathema to the Indian psyche. This is the land of Gandhi and all that. But what I'm saying is, 21st century, we cannot afford to continue to think like the downtrodden. You know, we should look for influence and expand our influence around the world, especially in the developing world. We lost the contest for influence. There's an amazing book by John Garver. I strongly recommend, if you haven't read it, Protracted Contest, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the 20th Century. And what Garver says is that we lost the battle for influence in the developing world when we were beaten in the Himalayas in 1962. Because after that, most of Africa and Latin America said, China is the biggest aid giver. China has won decisively over India in war. And India talks a lot, but cannot really provide them, you know, cannot be the net security provider or the net prosperity provider. So how can we do it? We can only do it with will and with a sense of purpose, where we are all unified and supporting, one, what our government is doing, and secondly, pushing the government to be more proactive. Now, you know, there's a situation in the Maldives right now, and people are all talking about it. It's become a major crisis, a constitutional crisis. It's being talked about one of the many theaters where China and India are in a tussle. You will not find a lot of debate in Indian media or among intelligentsia about what we should be doing in the Maldives. It's still a largely domestic question. I mean, it's still a largely domestically predisposed nation. Modi has done a big country with a lot of domestic issues, and I don't deny it. He's still preoccupied by whether Samajwadi Party you know, is winning, or whether Bahujan Samaj Party is winning in Uttar Pradesh. Right? So, what I've been, in our mission at Jindal has been to try and increase the level of global consciousness and to say that it's not all domestic issues. You know, what happens far away has an impact on us. And we have to have that, I break what I call the tyranny of geography. Latin America, what is you know, we say it's so far away, there's nothing strategic we can do with Latin America. It's also far away from China. They're building the railway connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific through Peru and through Brazil, across the Amazon. So they have developed that global mindset, and young people I find in China, especially among the elite institutions, are all keyed up to this. You know, One Belt, One Road is in many ways a manifestation of this global, or going out and, if not capturing, influencing and dominating the world. They have that instinct, you know, which we are yet to develop fully. So I think that the missing link in Joseph Nye's three-layered chessboard is the fourth one. It's not economic, military, or soft power alone. You need that national will or resolve. And that is work in the progress. So until we achieve that, I don't think we will be able to do the catch-up with China or to become number 2 in the world. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop at that. Thank you. And I'll open up to any comments or questions. Yes, please.
To revisit the matter of soft power, because 4 weeks ago the Indian foreign minister in the media claimed that India would be rolling out a strategy to become the world's biggest soft power. That coincided with me going through the global soft power index, where India was not in the top 20. But you said that by your criteria, and arguably there are different criteria, that India was in the top 5. So if you would please elaborate on why you have India in the top 5 and how India can become the world's biggest superpower. Not superpower, but soft power.
Yeah, thank you. You know, the interesting thing about the index is that while India is not yet making the cut, they usually have a human interest story or a box in the report which says Narendra Modi is #1 among world leaders in soft power rankings. So it's not state alone, but they are also ranking leaders. And why? You know, because he's social media savvy, and the selfies he takes, you know, have millions of views and shares, and he has an outreach, a mass outreach and a public outreach that far exceeds India's overall soft power, or is disproportionate to it around the world. In my book Modi Doctrine, I speak about a few innovations he has done, which are potentially very, very beneficial for India's soft power overall in the future. One is what I call G2P, government to people outreach. Generally, you know, the traditional diplomacy has been G2G, right? Government to government, and to some extent G2B, government to business, right? To promote investment, trade, that kind of thing. But G2P, government to people, public relations, public diplomacy that reaches out and you know, wins the hearts and minds of people around the world. That is something which we've been lagging. Mohan, I don't know what is the latest, but I heard public diplomacy, we only have 2 full-time staff doing the whole thing, you know, the Twitter, the Facebook, the collating the data from different embassies and projecting out and putting out press release is still very, very small compared to what the Chinese or the Americans have. And we have just not devoted enough resources for the public diplomacy that we should be to be able to be more effective in soft power. But I'll give you an interesting example. There was a story in the New York Times, I think 2 months ago, saying Indian movie industry is far more creative and technically more adept and brilliant than what the mainland Chinese are producing. And the outreach, the spread of the Indian movies, you know, the way they are being dubbed and watched in different languages around the world is far bigger. And to boot, Indian films have started raking in huge proceeds from distributing in China itself. There's a very interesting, strong feminist film called Secret Superstar that came about 6 months ago. If you haven't watched it, it's a must watch. It stars Amir Khan, and this movie was made at a budget of apparently 10 or 20 million or less in Indian rupee, dollar terms, and it has already collected 200 million in China, released with Chinese subtitles. A previous movie of Amir Khan called Dangal made about 500 crores in India, but over 1,000 crores just in the Chinese market. Very interesting. You know, the Chinese restrict Hollywood movie houses from distributing as freely as they can in the Chinese market. There are a lot of limits because they fear that it will inundate their local movie industry and all that. But Indian movies are making huge inroad, and they're seen to be, and it is, I think, a product of a freer society, right? Because we can say controversial things, of course there are all kinds of crazy people trying to block movies from being released, and I'm not going to go into details, but the point is the filmmakers are very creative. And I'll give you 2 examples and you will see the soft power difference between the 2 countries. 2 movie series, and it's a must watch. If you have not watched Tiger Zinda Hai, you should. It's a big, like a magnum opus kind of setting where Salman Khan is an Indian agent and he goes to Iraq and single-handedly, like an Indian Rambo, vanquishes the ISIS, the entire ISIS leadership, and gets back the Indian nurses. Actually, Indian nurses were stranded in Mosul in 2014, but actually they were not rescued through any commando action. But that's what our movie makers, we have creative license. But so now they've shown like battered landscape of the Sunni triangle in Iraq and the deserts. They've recreated all of it, shot it in Morocco. Amazing, yeah. I mean, if you're an Indian nationalist, at least on screen your dreams are coming true. We can't rescue our, 39 Indian laborers are still missing. They were abducted, most likely by ISIS or some affiliated group when they were in Iraq, and we are still not able to even trace where they are to this day. So most likely they're dead. But at least on screen we are doing this, right? Our heroes can go all the way up to Iraq and destroy the most dangerous terrorist group on planet and rescue our people and bring them back. This is tigers in the eye. Now they have, I think, generated enough revenues to become a big blockbuster. Now there is a parallel to this called the Wolf Warrior series in China. The Wolf Warrior, they have already had 2 episodes, two sequels. It's a 2-set thing. So Wolf Warrior 1, Wolf Warrior 2. Now this shows the Chinese going to Africa, and there's also a Rambo-like figure who fights all the bad guys, which are usually the Western. White people are usually shown as the villains, and then the Chinese rescue Africans, poor Africans, from Western exploitative practices and smuggling and all that. And they, it's also like a kick-ass action kind of thing, like explosions going all around and all that. But the point is, these are 2 comparable movies for you to understand the soft power difference. The Chinese motion picture industry is still very monochromatic. It's all very party dictated and party oriented, and they have a message that is not often at variance with cannot be at variance with what the government wants, right? So it's less attractive because of that. So I feel like, I'm just giving you one example. There are many things we can do further to become this #1 soft power. I think is very ambitious because it's an open field. Even small countries that don't necessarily are in the race to become a great power can exert significant soft power. Like the BBC, for all its biases, and there are biases in it, Britain is not a great power. Definitely not after Brexit. But it has that global soft power influence because of some historical legacies. So for us to be able, my own view is we have to have a world news television channel of our own that is beaming 24 hours and giving an Indian perspective on what is happening around the world. We don't yet have it. There's one small one, some of you may watch it, it's in English called Beyond. But it's not really, caught on in terms of global viewership, and it's a very small audience. It's definitely nothing compared to the big Western broadcast networks or Al Jazeera or CCTV of China or Russia Today. So we have a long way to go. There are many media where we need to actually influence global opinion. Now, this troll factory the Americans are talking about, the Russians had set up this operation in a building in St. Petersburg, and they're interfering in elections and all that. I wouldn't mind it if India can do something like a troll factory, and I had actually proposed that we set up not something that does fake news, but something that projects a positive image of India globally on various aspects, domestic and international. Our public diplomacy is under-equipped, and my own view is we should quadruple or quintuple the foreign service itself, but somehow, the priorities for defense and for foreign service are minimal compared to the domestic developmental agenda, the welfare state thing. So we have to reorganize those things really, as I said, to get ahead. Soft power needs resources, it cannot simply be saying that, Kama Sutra and yoga and, we are great. That's not how it's done. It's actually, it's a marketing domain, and we need to have a better public diplomacy and public relations. So let's see what happens. But we have some inherent strengths. That's what I'm trying to say, that we need to project more. Even our regional language cinema, if you look Tamil movies, for example, wherever there is a Tamil diaspora and even beyond, in East Asia especially, they become very popular. In Malaysia, in Japan, and so on. So that's where we need to do more. And of course, there's no substitute to having a proactive diplomacy and being involved and to be seen as a provider of solutions to problems. That's where I think we have lagged in the past. But I'm very hopeful about things like the Solar Alliance that we have started. The International Solar Alliance. Is it simply a token thing that's on paper, or will it actually generate public goods, including pooling of investment for new alternative energy projects, helping least developed countries to make the transition to green from fossil fuels? If we can achieve that and really devote, the other thing is the Asia-Africa growth corridor. That's another big idea that we are still waiting for it to actually materialize, because that can be our, if not an alternative, but definitely our own initiative parallel to the One Belt, One Road. So there are all these things we need to be doing to enhance soft power. It takes resources and vision. So hopefully, if the foreign minister is saying we want to be #1 soft power, then they better have a plan for it. Okay, any more comments? Yes.
Non-alignment and things how they've changed. When you talk about strategic autonomy, I have a very conceptual academic question. Meaning, do you see the traction back to Kautilya's Arthashastra again? And my second question is, we talk about Act East. MEA is talking about Act East, but really, I met somebody from ORF. I'm not going to name him, but he was telling me Act East is okay, but the real kind of game which is going to be played is the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, and especially with regard to a lot of Indian diaspora are there in Saudi Arabia. So that's how Prime Minister would want to engage. And we are talking about Act East, but in reality, there would be some kind of optics which is going to be played out in that particular part. So do you really think that that's correct? That kind of a assumption, would that be a correct one?
Thank you. Strategic autonomy, I don't know if Kautilya referred to it in Arthashastra. The one that we most know about, this is this important political treatise, going back to the 4th century BC. It's supposed to be the basis of Indian statecraft. The one that we most are familiar with is the Mandela Theory, and how your neighbor's neighbor is your ally. And in a way, there's an interesting book by Avinash Paliwal called My Enemy's Enemy. It's based on the Kautilya notion. It's about India and Afghanistan and how they share so much in common because there is a state in between them, which is a problem state. So, but autonomy, I think it emerges from the struggle for independence and for freedom. It's more like a 20th century phenomenon, because when the British Empire was doing foreign policy, there was no concept of autonomy. It was all about dominance and about, from Kolkata, they would decide the fate of Africa and of the Middle East, right? The Curzonian foreign policy was that India should become the basis for which we will dominate the world by being based here. So autonomy, the idea comes actually from the independence struggle and the liberation movements, nationalist movement for struggle, and the idea that we have been under imperial yoke for centuries, and we need to now break out of that and make our own choices. And that holds even now, even to this day. And that's the reason I said with the United States, sometimes we are very protective about our autonomy, and we don't give up even when they pressurize us. As to the Act East vis-a-vis look West, it's not an either-or thing. To become a major power, you have to obviously have significant influence in different corners of the world. Tomorrow, I think later today, or is it tomorrow, we have Negin Pao and others speaking on our neighbors. Yeah, so you will have a full session on Act East and on India's neighbors and all these from my colleagues. But all I can say is that I think the contestation is much higher in Act East because of China. Look West, frankly, there is no power that is going to obstruct India's rise in that region, And in fact, there's an expectation that India plays a bigger political role in the Middle East. And right now, it's mainly the diaspora and the oil, and it's more like a transactional relationship, investment. Prime Minister is doing a lot with Abu Dhabi, for example, with the UAE. But there is a missing strategic dimension where we are not able to really, for example, India is not part of the quartet, the Middle East, for the Palestinian peace process. India is not part of any major grouping that's involved in negotiations or attempted conflict resolution for Syria and so on. So these are the big questions of that region, right? So I think we are still weak relatively strategically in terms of our projection on the West. So we do need to, I think, devote significant time to that region, more attention to it. Iran becomes very important because of that. You know, I hope, my own view is Chabahar is not purely for economic or for geostrategic reasons to bypass Pakistan and all that, but ultimately it is to be able to secure our bases on both ends of the Indian Ocean. So the Western Indian Ocean is the Gulf of Oman, right? People don't look at it that way, because if you look at a map of the world, that part of the world is shown as the Arabian Sea, but that's nothing but the Western Indian Ocean. It's the same thing. So we need to do more and think differently in the West, but there is no significant resistance. In the Act East there is, because of the clear, you know, Chinese expansion and the old US presence is there in the Pacific. They have a Pacific fleet and a Pacific command. So it's more contentious, you see. Indo-Pacific is actually the zone of a lot of great power contestation. On this side, Russia, United States, of course, they keep tussling in the Middle East, but India has not yet become a kind of a player to be part of, to play that kind of great game in that region. But East Asia and Indian Ocean and west coast of Africa, that's where I think we will do it. So it's a question of different structural realities of these two regions. But it's not either or. In fact, as I said, the great power, the definition of great power is a country that's able to wield influence far and wide beyond its own immediate neighborhood. So unfortunately, in India, whenever we talk of foreign policy, people largely talk about Pakistan or China. You know, we don't talk about Chile or Honduras or Ghana. You see, so that has to change. That means our stakes are still low in those regions. You know, primarily it's still a very, very neighborhood-centered mindset. You know, and Modi has tried to change it, make it a global mindset, so that the Middle East or the Far East become very, very central in our imagination of what we should be doing. And that defines, you see, if the vision is narrow, that defines or limits the scope of action. You know, why are we less concerned about a constitutional crisis in Kenya or in Honduras, whereas, you know, there have been disputed elections where the incumbent is unwilling to let go, and there's trouble there. Why are we less influenced about them vis-a-vis Maldives? That's because we are still not yet thinking globally or thinking of, you know, being active, and don't yet have the willpower and the resources for it, you see. So the further we think, the better is break the tyranny of the geography. That's how you become a great power. So it's important. Look West is important, but I think the real challenge and the game will be in the Act East. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you very much for the lecture. And just not to know what about my colleagues from that might be very brief. I am from Ministry of Argentina, and I have then noticed that from the program itself and from some parts of your lecture, you tend sometimes to equate Africa and Latin America as if they were two distinct realities. I completely believe I'm sure what I tell you that we own for the vast and immense amount of territory and diverse countries where the two regions, they're two very different regions with all very particularities. But when you mentioned Latin America in particular and China's clout, I would certainly agree that China has outcrowned the United States basically as a major trading and investment partner of many of our countries. But I think you've also mentioned China's soft power in the region, and let me assure you that from a citizen perspective there is either none or very low soft power from China in Latin America, which in itself is extremely different if we speak of Latin America and South America. They're two very different cultural and geographical entities. Chinese, and I think that might be a sort of a widespread sort of poll opinion if you see among citizens in the region, are either fear or mistrust. They definitely might be seen as a big checkbook, but they have certainly not declared as the United States as we go during the 20th century, which is certainly on decline.
Yeah.
But there is also some sort of a vacant space
Yeah.
which has not yet been covered since the US has started the plan. And that is certainly not in the case of China.
Yeah.
Still gaining from that. So I think that is a very important nuance to make, which tends to
Absolutely.
become a
Even in
dynamic
Africa,
one was
even in
making
Africa,
about- even Africa.
even Africa,
Even Africa.
there is a backlash from below to what the Chinese are doing. It's well known, but
Even Africa.
but you're right. See, for us, the difference is geography. You see, Africa is the east coast of Africa is the western end of the Indian Ocean. Countries like Kenya, Tanzania,
see
Mozambique, they're very central to
the
us.
Indian diaspora in those countries.
Yeah, exactly. But Latin America is seen as, we're buying oil from Venezuela, but as you know, there are massive upheaval going on there, and we really, probably we have a position on it, an official position. I'm not even sure about it. But hardly anyone cares, right? What India says about the crisis in Latin America. But people want to know what China's position is, what the United States' position is, because they have that leverage there, right? So that's what I'm talking about, where we are missing. We have to break this notion that Latin America is too far, and therefore we'll only do trade with them and nothing else, you see.
Yes. And my second part of the question, and I think probably you already addressed it, is do you think that with the catching up with the concept of strategic economy, if you label India's foreign policy as research for strategic economy, regardless of the label that might have been put on alignment between 47 and 91, if we see all the trends that you have mentioned post 1991 and specifically the efforts for the post 2014 until now, with
Yeah,
emphasis on certain
it's a
feminine
constant
quests.
strain. It's a constant strain. But I will say that the quest is really for greatness, now, not before. The ambition is to become a leading power, great power, even if sometimes it means adjusting our rigid notions of strategic autonomy. In the past, it was always strategic autonomy. We have to survive. It is about survival, that's all. In this big, pond full of big fish, we are the smallest, and we just have to survive and just make sure that we are free of interference from all the others. Now it's about how can we become a big fish ourselves, and if sometimes it requires an alignment, we are willing to do that for strategy. So I think in a way, there is a kind of a trade-off between strategic autonomy and the quest to become a great power, because otherwise you cannot make tactical alliances and alignments and opportunistic things which have a greater impact. We did that even during as I said, in 62 and 71 also. We made compromises on strategic autonomy, but overall it is a strain, it still remains. But maybe it will have to be downplayed to some extent. We will have to show greater flexibility. Doctrines
Don't take the autonomy, maybe in search for something else.
in search for great power status. We may have to, because of the isosceles triangle I spoke about. It's not possible to fully, because there's nothing like a free lunch in foreign relations, right? You cannot have the cake and eat it too. Boris Johnson thinks that he can, but I don't think the Europeans are letting him have it, So I think we may have to actually, at some stages, downplay the excessive emphasis on strategic autonomy, at least at the rhetorical level, and instead show greater nimbleness in grasping an opportunity. And sometimes it need not only be in US or China, it may have to do even other middle powers in different regions of the world. We may have to align closer with their interests at in certain moments to be able to capitalize more. So this is more a kind of a realist kind of a vision I'm giving. Yeah. Okay, any other comments before I leave you to lunch? There's a lot more to discuss. This is just the panoramic view I've given. We're now actually going to go into neighborhood and Middle East and Indian Ocean, and tomorrow morning we have my colleague Pankaj is speaking about terrorism and national security and all these things. So there's a lot, and then Professor Mohan Kumar he's just about to publish a new book on India and the WTO and multilateral trade negotiations, a lot on economic diplomacy coming up. We've tried to cover as many issues, but we want feedback from you as to how this can get better. Next time we do it next month, and what other subjects which we may not be covering this time, but we could do next time, and maybe the format, and we could do a lot of things. We're very flexible. So thank you all for your time, and really with great humility, I want to say that it's a big endeavor for us, and the fact that you're supporting it means a lot, because as an academic institution, we believe it's not just about giving degrees, to students, our regular students. We have to do more of these executive education programs, more of the outreach to the diplomatic community, and I hope that you will tell your friends about the quality of this show that we've put up. And I request your time to also give brief video interviews to our crew at the end of the event, or maybe at the end of the day, to simply say how you may have benefited from this and what you've learned from this, and how this may help you with your careers, because that will help us to reach out to more ambassadors and more high commissioners for the next rounds of these trainings, to show that we are adding value to your work as diplomats. Okay, thank you all, thank you so much, thank you. I have to rush somewhere. Huh?